Okay, I don't know how many of you are aware, but today marks the 80th anniversary of the Japanese signing the surrender terms in Tokyo Bay aboard the USS Missouri, marking the end of World War II. It just kind of happened that this was scheduled for today. We didn't realize it when we were scheduling it initially, that it was indeed the 80th anniversary of the end of the war. Americans were overjoyed, not just because the war was over, but it meant that soon it would mean an end to rationing. Everybody had had their fill of it for 4 years, and now they're ready to get back to living life as usual. Okay, so let's back up for just a moment. When we talk about rationing, what exactly do we mean? There we go. Put simply, rationing is used during times of stress, disaster, or war in order to control shortages, there we go, ensure adequate supplies for the armed forces, and most importantly, guarantee a fair distribution for those on the home front. Especially when we're talking about wartime, but those all apply to making sure that everybody gets fed and is taken care of in disasters as well. During wars and disasters in the past, particularly during sieges, when a city might be surrounded by enemy troops, the wealthy could afford rising food costs, but the poor could not. So that usually led to scarcity, starvation in many cases. During the siege of Paris in 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, the mayors of the individual districts of Paris got together, and I'm not sure if you're aware of it, that Paris actually is made up of 22 different districts called arrondissements. Each one has a mayor. There is no one mayor of Paris. But all the different mayors got together and figured out, we're running out of food. We have to figure out what we can do, because we definitely need to start thinking about a way to control, to make sure that everybody gets something to eat. The ration cards were first issued during the siege of Paris in 1870. After that, their goal was to prevent hoarding. They wanted to make sure that there wasn't anybody who was going out and buying all the beef and all the coffee and everything. And also they were expressed want to avoid any starvation that might occur. During World War I, there were very similar situations. They started issuing ration cards, but depending on the difficulties going on in each country, made a big difference as to how they handled it. During World War I, within a month of the beginning of the war, the British Royal Navy put a blockade around the German port cities in the north. So Germany started running short on supplies almost immediately. So Germany started rationing midway through 1915. They didn't start issuing ration cards until the last quarter of 1915, and then started issuing more expansive ration cards in 1916. Germany was also had the problem that they were drafting everybody that was working on the farms. So they didn't have a surplus of labor because everybody was being scooped up by the German army. As a result, you had a lot of food that wasn't being collected, wasn't being produced. So that led to malnutrition and starvation to some degree, even though they had ration cards. Now, in England, it was very different. England was being supplied by the United States. In fact, the United States, long before they entered the war, had provided almost all of the food to France, Italy, Belgium, unoccupied Belgium that is, and England. And England really did not have a problem with food supplies during World War I until Germany started their unlimited U-boat campaign in 1917. They were very successful in putting a chokehold on the English market. And in 1918, England started rationing by issuing ration books. The other major Allied power was France. France did not have much of its farmland impacted, so they managed to get food out okay, but a lot of people couldn't afford to get it because the inflation had gone through the roof. Everything in France cost so much more because a lot of the production areas were either under occupation by the Germans or threatened with immediate occupation by the Germans. So they started initiating ration cards for bread and for some meats, but for the most part, they didn't have that much to worry about. People could get things as long as they could afford them. So that was the issue during World War I. So what prompted rationing in the U.S. during World War II? Well, to understand that, you kind of have to take a look back to the United States before the war. A, what was going on because of the Great Depression, but B, everything that was going on in the world that one way or the other affected the United States. The U.S. was barely out of the Depression in 1940, and it certainly was not the industrial powerhouse that it would be by the end of the war in 1945. Unemployment still high, but dropping. Inflation was remarkably low, at less than 1%. But it was slowly increasing. But the biggest number to look at was the Consumer Price Index, which at 1940 was 13.9%. Now, if you have inflation that's pretty steady, but the Consumer Price Index starts to go up, you're going to start to see an increase in inflation. The Consumer Price Index has a great deal to do with that inflation rate. Well, by April, you can see the numbers there. The Consumer Price Index increased a little bit, but pretty much still held steady for a while. By December 1940, however, we're starting to see where unemployment is dropping and the Consumer Price Index is starting to rise because more and more people have the money to buy the things they do, therefore creating a problem with supply and demand, and that's going to start to drive up the Consumer Price Index. As the war expanded in Europe and in Asia, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established something called the Council of National Defense Advisory Board. He did that on May 29th in 1940. Their job, in addition to coordinating military and civilian authorities in the event of a war, was also to report to the president and let him know what was going to be endangered for the United States if war should come. And it was starting to look more and more that it wasn't going to be an if, it was going to be a when, even as early as middle of 1940. In July 1941, Roosevelt and most of his administration were all but certain that the United States was going to be in a war within 1 year. It took a little bit less than that, however. In the same month of July, Japan completed the conquest of French Indochina, the countries we know today as Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos, and portions of Thailand. To make matters worse, not just the fact that we no longer were going to be getting rubber out of Indochina, which was, kind of a small amount as far as the United States was concerned. Indochina is right next door to the Dutch East Indies, what we know now as Indonesia. That is the real worry point. 95% of American rubber came out of French Indochina. The Department of Treasury released its July report about inflation. Inflation had gone to 1.44% in January of 1941. By July, it was 5%. They were pretty sure, according to the Treasury, we're looking at that 5% doubling to 10% by the end of the year. It actually doubled in November. They didn't have to wait till December. Okay, with inflation rising, FDR signed Executive Order 8875 on August 28, 1941. There will be no tests following this, so you do not have to remember dates or numbers, just for your edification. And it established the Office of Price Administration. Oops, come back here. There we go. And the OPA had the authority to investigate and, if necessary, place ceilings on food prices and rent in order to try and help keep inflation down. It was effectively a piece of New Deal legislation. By now, the New Deal is pretty much over, but they're trying to figure out what worked during the Depression so that if the U.S. had to go to war, they would kind of get a little bit of a head start. But the OPA would become far more valuable than anybody had predicted to that point. Whoops, I'm sorry, a little too far there. So on a calm Sunday morning in early December of 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a major naval base in the Hawaiian Islands that most Americans had never even heard of. Japan also attacked and invaded Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, the Malay Peninsula, and the Solomon Islands. And they had positioned themselves to interdict and cut off most of the world's raw materials that are needed to maintain a wartime footing for other nations. Japan was in control of 2 of the United States strategic commodities. Like I mentioned before, 95% of the U.S. supply of rubber came from Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, and over half of the U.S. sugar supply came exclusively out of the Philippines alone. The other half would soon be threatened coming out of the Caribbean and South America by German U-boats in just over a month. The OPA authorized towns, cities, counties to create ration boards. And this was so that they could administer the new programs that were going to be coming out, and also because they were formed from local individuals, they would have a better idea of what the local individuals genuinely needed. So there wasn't somebody leading from afar trying to tell everybody what to do from Washington. We had board members here in Culpeper who were our friends and family. And they knew that if somebody was having difficulty with the rationing, that they could be helped out. But they knew that they were genuinely having difficulty. It wasn't just a matter of somebody saying, hey, I need more gasoline or whatever. And if you're curious to know where the ration board was located here in Culpeper, does everybody here know where where West Street is? Show of hands. Oh, quite a few of you. Okay, excellent. Well, if you come out the museum and you go down Davis Street and you get to West Street, if you stop with the courthouse right here, right across this corner here, 102 South West Street, it's now 4 apartments in what used to be the Johnson Law Building. That is where the ration board was located. So if you need additional gasoline, go talk to the folks that live there. And don't tell them I sent you. Okay, so between December 27th and December 31st of 1941, the National Defense Advisory Board presented their news to President Roosevelt and informed him that the United States only had enough rubber reserves to last 1 year. There was no way in the world that they could, pun aside, stretch the supply in any way whatsoever. So somehow rubber would have to be conserved. And in order to do that, to support the war effort. So what they advised to President Roosevelt was that they implemented means to prevent the supply of rubber from being used too quickly. And the plan was really quite simple. It made up 4 different aspects. The first one is ration the tires. Make it difficult for people to get tires by rationing them. That way you could limit how quickly people's tires were used up. You could also ration gasoline. If people don't have enough gas to drive around, they're not going to be going through their tires, right? The next one ration cars themselves. Make it difficult. Make people use the cars they already have instead of buying new cars. Like a lot of times, if a car gets 3, 4, 5 years old, you go out and buy a new car. You get the new style and everything, right? Not during World War II. All cars were rationed as of January 1st, 1942. And last but not least, let's set a nationwide speed limit of 35 miles an hour. Now, bear in mind that we weren't used to interstate travel at that point in time. We didn't get around quite as much. After all, that's why God made trains, right? Yeah? So the national speed limit of 35 miles an hour really only impacted people going like from here to Richmond, Washington, D.C., it really didn't get out and drive much beyond that. You would more often than not take the train. So tire rationing was announced in local newspapers on January 1st, 1942. As announced here in the Culpeper Exponent. And if you're really interested and you have a lot of time, you can go to the Culpeper Exponent in the website, and you could search through all of the newspapers they have online. It was a weekly paper. It was only 8 pages, but you can still spend days looking for stuff. Ask me how I know. Okay, and here again on January 15th, information about tire rationing. You were allowed to have, wait a minute, there we go. You were allowed to have 5 tires, 1 on each at end of each axle and a spare. Americans were limited not in how many tires they could purchase, but how many tires they could own. You had to declare how many tires you had, and back then people would stack tires up in their garage. Any additional tires you had over 5 had to be turned into the car.
Is that per car or?
Well, most families only had 1 car. You didn't need to, because mom usually stayed at home and took care of the kids and the house and everything. The husbands were usually the ones going to and from work. And that raises another issue we'll go over in just a moment. If you needed new tires, you could apply for tires with the ration board. Right down here on West Davis Street, you just go in there and you have to come up with a legitimate reason why you needed more tires than 5. And you almost never got them. If you look at some of the dilapidated vehicles, it's not unusual for somebody to get a flat because their tires are all worn out and then go ahead and replace it with a spare that looked rattier than what you just took off of your car. As a matter of fact, if you've ever watched the old cartoons, if you haven't, I highly recommend it. Go to YouTube and just look up cartoons 1942, 1943. They're hilarious. There's one in particular from 1942, and it made fun of all the people in the country who were patching worn out tires because the ration board wouldn't give them new ones. But this is a 1942 cartoon called Tire Trouble. Hilarious. Go look it up. The OPA also announced a freeze on all car sales. Like I said, January 1st, 1942. This was especially problematic because dealerships had already stocked up on cars that they planned to sell throughout the year. 520,000 cars were now in dealerships that they weren't allowed to sell. In February of 1942, ration boards were permitted to start rationing cars from the remaining inventory that was sitting out on all of these car dealers' lots, but only to individuals in certain professions like doctors, the clergy, and restrictive professions like that. Because older used cars were not rationed, there was an order that came out on January 29th, as you can see here, that made it illegal to keep junked cars as well. Junkyards, scrap yards, all sorts of places like that that had old beat-up cars had to turn them into scrap. If they didn't, the government was going to come seize it and then turn it into scrap. The whole idea was we do not need people repairing their cars to put them back out on the highway. The whole idea behind rationing cars, save the rubber, cut back on those supplies, save the tires. And while we're on the subject of gasoline and rubber and cars, here's a little something near and dear to everybody's heart. Gasoline rationing was started in May 15th, 1942. And again, you had to justify the need to get a gasoline ration card in the first place. You didn't automatically get it. So gasoline was not guaranteed. Getting a gas ration card, not guaranteed. All right, you were limited to essential trips like war work, medical emergencies, farming. You were not just allowed to go leisure driving anymore. There was the big billboard that was constantly put up all over the country. Is this trip really necessary? To get people thinking, you know, I could take the bus to the grocery store. I don't have to drive. Again, the whole idea, cut back on what you're using. And is this trip really necessary almost became a national joke. Is even asked by Bugs Bunny. If you've ever seen this cartoon, guy hits a home run, runs all the way around, and stops short of home plate with Bugs Bunny holding the sign. He takes the ball, reaches out, and touches and tags him out. Absolutely hilarious. Again, Woody Woodpecker, is this trip really necessary? And it got to be so amusing. They painted this plane was named, "Is this trip necessary?" So, you know, indeed. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yeah. Given the rural lifestyle out here, the farming, and I'm sure the animals, how did the people rely on animals for transportation?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because it just so happens I ran across an ad in the Culpeper Exponent because the country was I know, right? This is my plant, my brother, in case you're wondering. The Culpeper Exponent put this information out because they were encouraging alternatives to driving your car, and Amarillo, Texas decided about 40 horses were going to be brought out of the stables instead of the cars, so people could take a horse to work instead. There were also bicycles, but as we'll see in a little bit, bicycles began to be rationed as well. But they encouraged public transportation, carpooling for people who had to drive, and like I said, the Culpeper Exponent pointing out even using horses. Now, when you got a ration card, it was broken down into categories. So if you just needed a car, the gasoline, to drive 5 or 6 miles to the gas station that you preferred to go to, you were issued an A card. An A card is roughly 3 to 4 gallons a week. It changed every once in a while. So it started out at 3 gallons of gas, then it went to 4, then it went back to 3, and then the OPA figured, well, we give it 4, That happened quite a lot with a number of things. The amount of points necessary to purchase something changed quite a bit. This card allowed one to get, like I said, 3 to 4 gallons of gas a week. Often left people stranded or stuck at home. You always hear stories in movies set during this time period. Somebody, Cary Grant, walks up and it says, well, what took you so long? Well, I had to walk. And it said, well, why did you walk? And he's, you know how it is with these A cards. Still, despite all the grumbling, people found ways to make fun of the situation. It's so much easier to get through hard times with a sense of humor, right? A really, really good radio program at the time was Fibber McGee and Molly. And Fibber McGee and Molly actually worked for the government for a few months where they made shows that were relevant to the problems that people were having with rationing. The very first one, Fibber McGee was complaining about getting 4 gallons of gas a week. And every time somebody would come in or leave, Fibber McGee was left by himself, and he would just 4 gallons of gas. The B card was less common than the A card and was usually reserved for essential workers. And by essential, we're talking about individuals who worked in war plants. If you lived in Culpeper and you worked in a plant in Charlottesville, you needed that extra fuel in order to get there to work, because if you're not there, it impacts the production. And that's very important for the war effort. So people got a B card and were allowed a little bit more gas. Now, that wasn't just war work in factories. It also included hospital workers, doctors, nurses. If they had to go to their hospital, they have to be there because heaven knows when we're going to have an air raid. If we had an air raid and we had a bunch of wounded civilians, but the nurse and the doctor couldn't get to the hospital because of the lack of gasoline, oh, you know there'd be something to pay. Ration Card C was issued even less frequently and was only given to Americans with a critical role in society, like policemen, firemen, clergy, post office employees. They got a C card. It gave an additional 8 gallons of gas on top of a B or an A card. So this was supplemental. It was you had to put the C card in the window of your car, so that if you drove up to a gas station and you presented your card, if you had an A card on your car and you presented a C card, we could have problems. They might not sell you any gasoline, which could lead to a lot of difficulties further on down the road. Another ration card was even less common, but would have been frequently seen around Culpeper, and that was Ration Card R, and that was for non-highway use, such as farming and large highway maintenance vehicles. They received an R ration card. It was not unlimited, but it was quite a lot more gasoline that you could get with an A, a B, or a C card because it impacted food production. There was also the T ration card. These were for truckers and delivery drivers. There was the D ration card, which was for motorcyclists. Anybody come here tonight in a motorcycle? Yeah, you've got a D ration card looking at you. And this is one that took me back for a moment when I first saw it. There's an M ration card for essential motorcycle drivers. And at first I was like, essential? What in the world qualifies as essential? Well, anybody who's a messenger on a motorcycle for the air raids, for Western Union, for the telegraph, all sorts of things like that, considered essential. If you had a motorcycle, you got an M card. There was an E card for small highway machinery. There was an S card for judges and lawyers. In theory, they got more gas, but personally, I think they should have got less. But, you know, that's just me. But perhaps the rarest of ration cards was Ration Card X. It was an unlimited amount of gasoline, and because of the people who received it were considered vital, not just essential, but vital government employees, like the CEO of a shipyard. He got X. And the X ration card happens to be at the center of one of the biggest ration scandals of the war. 100 congressmen, I guess I really don't have to continue, do I? But 100 congressmen decided to give themselves an X card because they were vital to running the country. Well, there were an awful lot of Americans who felt otherwise, and there are a lot of adjectives to describe Congress. Vital doesn't really come to everybody's mind. So they turned that around very quickly, made it very clear and apparent to the congressmen. They all turned in their X cards, and they were issued A cards. Now, some congressmen, because of the committees they were on, got B and C cards, but these 100 congressmen went straight to A. The way ration cards worked was actually pretty simple. a supplier delivered gas to you if you were the owner or the operator of a gasoline store. You were issued, I'm sorry, let me back up. You got your ration card and you bought gasoline from the gas station. Now, when you first get your ration card, you're supposed to write your license plate number on the ration stamps themselves so that the government can track it. And trust me, they tracked it. There was a thriving black market in gasoline stamps, and the OPA was especially good at finding the counterfeits. The gasoline station attendant would collect the ration card, the ration stamps, when he sold you your 3 gallons of gas or 4 gallons of gas, depending on when it was. And they would take these stamps and they would glue them to what they called bingo sheets. And as you can see, this is an original from 1942. We have one of them in the gasoline rationing notebook you're welcome to look through. And they glued them to these bingo sheets, which I think are appropriately named, and then they would use the bingo sheets by turning them over to their suppliers. The suppliers would then take them to the bank, and just like making a business deposit, had to fill out a deposit slip for all of these coupons. The coupons were counted up just like you would count all your pennies as you go to the bank to turn in the day's receipts, and those bingo cards, bingo sheets would end up at the OPA, and they would examine every single stamp on every single sheet all across the country. Now, they went to local spots first, but then they were checked again when they went further up the chain. If they had any counterfeits, they would contact the bank, and the bank would then say, hey, we gave you credit for this much, and they would actually write a check, as you can see, for however many gallons of gas that individual is permitted to purchase from the supplier. So then the supplier brings more gas to the gas station, but only as much as he had valid gasoline ration stamps to begin with. If they turned in valid stamps a second time, those stamps went towards covering the deficit caused by the counterfeit stamps. There's a really good video out there of an original OPA training film on why you should not buy counterfeit stamps. They explain it very clearly, probably much more so than I just did. So the big question, did gasoline rationing actually work? Well, if you looked at the overall gasoline consumption between 1941 and 1944, gasoline consumption actually dropped 32%. That's 1/3 less fuel needed on Americans' highways. I says, well, that's great, but gasoline was never really the issue in the first place. We've got gasoline. The United States was producing more gasoline, almost more gasoline than they needed, but it wasn't about gasoline. It was about the rubber. So what effect did the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit have on the limit on tires? Between 1941 and 1944, the exact same time frame, 35-mile-an-hour speed limit extended the life of tires by a factor of 4. So, did it work? Yes, absolutely it worked. But it wasn't just gasoline that was rationed. Fuel oil was also rationed. Most of the fuel oil, understandably, went to the northern and western states where they needed fuel oil in the wintertime a lot more. For those of us down in Florida, I used to live in Florida, came from Tampa, Florida, up here to Culpeper, loving every minute, just thought I'd point that out. And in Florida, you don't need as much fuel oil for heat. We have a summer in Florida, it's about 2 weeks, but not all at once. So winter, thank you. I told you I was, hang on, let me get a sip of vodka here. Okay, much better. So there was also ration on kerosene for the exact same reasons. Not much for light by 1940, but very much so for heat. We also had ration on solid fuels. What do you think qualifies as a solid fuel? Coal, thank you, number one. Number two, firewood. You were rationed on firewood. Now, we're not talking about the wood that you go out and cut down a tree in your backyard or anything. You got enough trees to do that, knock yourself out. We're talking about processed firewood that's sold by the cord. And also, believe it or not, charcoal briquettes. We think of charcoal briquettes just for the, for the grill. Okay, charcoal briquettes were used in heating stoves as well. Now, about that other problem, sugar. Sugar rationing was vital. It was the first food item to be rationed by the OPA, and it was the last to be taken off. Rumors of sugar rationing were being bandied about as early as January 29th, as you can see by this article in the Culpeper Exponent. Once rumors started circulating, people began hoarding sugar, which created a run on sugar. Stores had difficulty stocking it, and prices rose as the supply dwindled. And people were disappointed when they got to the store only to be, to find empty shelves where there used to be pounds and pounds of sugar. Giant grocery stores warned of unscrupulous grocers out there who would lure you in with low prices and not have any sugar available. But you're already at the grocery store, right? So you're going to go ahead and buy everything else. You've already budgeted out your food. And so they said that, yeah, we will do everything we can for the supply of sugar at our store. But if we do run out, then we'll start advertising at a much higher rate like everybody else, but we won't have any. Also, they got tired of hearing people constantly coming in and asking about sugar. We sell other stuff too. We've got beef and pork and bread and all the other things you need. And, life does not run on sugar alone. Yeah, I know, right? That's what my research told me. I don't believe it, but yeah. As rumors continued to swirl, the OPA was forced to freeze all sales of sugar between April 28th and May 5th, 1942. It was for a period of 1 week so that they could prepare for all the rationing that they would have to do. So what they did is they asked the ration boards to use the schools as a location for signing up for their ration cards, for their sugar ration cards. And teachers were asked to help out with the registration and also the distribution of the sugar ration card. So here's a photograph. I don't know where this came from exactly, but if you look in one of these books over here, you'll find it. It's an actual press photo from a different location, different newspaper. It's for TT Minor School. But you can see this is characteristic of the mayhem that happened in Culpeper when the sugar rationing was brought on board. If you had been one of those hoarders that had been driving the price of sugar up through the roof, you had to account for all the sugar you had at home. Once you gave that number, they took out the necessary stamps to make up for the amount of sugar that you had stuffed in your pantry. So because sugar had so many uses beyond cakes and candies, the restrictions were spread across the entire population by need. Mr. and Mrs. America would now only receive half of what they would have used in 1941. So roughly 1/2 per week, 1/2 pound per week. Likewise, restaurants, hotels, hospitals, all limited in their sugar distribution for their customers. Again, 1/2 pound. Industry, believe it or not, relies on sugar. Once sugar is broken down, sugar is used in steel mills to help break down the coal into coke quicker. So that way they get a higher heat, and that way they can pull the steel back a little bit quicker. But the biggest thing was the military If they needed 1 pound, they got 1 pound. We had to make sure that all of our soldiers, sailors, and Marines were in top fighting condition because they were the ones who were putting their life on the line. We don't need to be cutting back on their sugar. Okay, at this time, I'm going to ask everybody to reach underneath your seat, and taped to the bottom of your chair is an envelope. It may have fallen on the floor while we've been talking, but if you open that up, this is a small token of our appreciation for y'all coming out here, and this is a reproduction of the Sugar Ration book. This was called Ration Book 1, and War Ration Book 1, and it was used for the sugar rationing. The different coupons stood for different things. Certain times you were not allowed to use a coupon before its validity date, and those were published in the paper as far as what time you can come in and everything. Roughly 180 of these were printed, and you can see it's an exact reproduction. It's just one sheet of paper with 28 stamps on it. 123 million were actually issued. You can find original coupons that have not been used, War Ration Book number 1, that have not been used. They're actually not that expensive. I mean, they only had a surplus of 47 million cards, right? Initially, each stamp was valid towards the purchase of 1 pound of sugar. So just like the gas ration stamps, you needed both the coupon and the money in order to take a 1 pound bag of sugar home. The stamp was only valid for a 2-week window, which was announced in the newspaper, as I said. After that, it was no good. If you didn't go out during that week to buy your sugar, you were out sugar that week. You would have to wait until the next stamp, sorry about that, until the next stamp came out in order to get that. Not all stamps were used for sugar as the war raged on, but other items were added to the OPA's expanding list of rationed items. And this is a list of what everything ended up being valid for on all the different coupons. You can see it's mostly sugar. Their shoes got rationed, and coffee got rationed also. While sugar was important to everyday life in the U.S., Americans were quite adept at finding ways around that. They used molasses, they used corn syrup, they used honey, they used maple syrup, they used gelatin mix, they used fruit, anything that would sweeten whatever it was they were making so that you didn't have to use the sugar. And there were articles in magazines, articles in newspapers about how much equated of these different products to 1 cup of sugar. If one lost their sugar ration book, and based on classified ads in the Culpeper Exponent, you can see there was quite a lot of that, you had to prove that you had indeed lost it. Now, I have no earthly idea how you go about doing that. Throw yourself on the mercy of the ration board and see what happens. But you still, I mean, I don't think people were trying to collect ration books, but you never know. There were rumors that sugar was plentiful, but sugar rationing had been instituted for health reasons. That was the rumor. There's little to substantiate that that was actually the case, but they did an examination in England. A survey was taken by the National Health Institute, and between 1951 and 1956, because of sugar rationing in England, they noticed a 35% drop in diabetes and a 20% drop in high blood pressure. Now, in actuality, sugar was restricted because of poor harvests, bad weather, labor shortages, and shortages of fertilizer, both in 1941 and again in 1944. Oh, and about those U-boats. German U-boats started prowling American and Caribbean waters as early as January of 1942. The United States hadn't learned how to black out cities yet. So Germany had no difficulty navigating from one brightly lit New York to another brightly lit Delaware, and so on down the line. If you're interested in that particular campaign, I can highly recommend this book by Dr. Michael Gannon. He has unfortunately passed. He was one of my instructors at the University of Florida long ago. And the book is fascinating, talking about how easy it was for the Germans to interdict just about everything coming from South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Which brings us to coffee rationing. This is the third major food group in the United States after sugar and gasoline. Sorry. And at any rate, the coffee rationing, it didn't take long for the OPA to realize that they had a serious problem because of rationing on coffee. Was completed on November 29, 1942, again after a one-week freeze on all coffee sales. There had been a bumper crop of coffee in South America, across all of South America, but it didn't do much good because Germany was torpedoing almost half the vessels coming out of South America. So that kept supplies low, so the OPA had to institute coffee rationing. Everyone of the age of 15 had been allotted 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks. That comes out to 10.5 pounds a year. In February of 1943, that was reduced to 1 pound every 6 weeks, which is 8.5 pounds a year. Less than 1 cup of coffee a day, half the average amount that Americans drank prior to rationing. Like stretching sugar, American magazines flourished with articles on stretching or substituting coffee, as well as methods to get the best cup of coffee, whether you're doing it by drip brewing, whether you're doing it by percolating, or by boiling. The most efficient way for a flavorful cup of coffee, it was determined, was boiling. Drip coffee gave you the least. And if that was too much difficulty for you, there was always Postum. Postum was invented in 1895 and soared in popularity starting in 1942. Coffee was often in short supply, so because you had a coupon did not mean that you automatically could pick up your pound of coffee when with your ration stamp. So there were some times where grocers would take the names of individuals that they knew so that they could let them know, hey, we've got some coffee in before we run an ad, you might want to come in and get some. Other grocers would break the seals on the coffee to prevent people from hoarding it. You know, once you open a can of coffee, it doesn't last forever. So in order to keep people from hoarding coffee, they would break the seals on the coffee. Either way, the OPA actually halted rationing on coffee on July 28, 1943. There was a scare in 1944 when coffee supplies dipped, but the OPA raised prices to control demand. It worked, so rationing was not reintroduced. Coffee was the first food product to come off of rationing during World War II. Okay, so gas, rubber, sugar, not the only items rationed. What other rationed items do we have? Well, believe it or not, typewriters were rationed. They were seized and rationed by the OPA on March 1942 to ensure that the government had enough typewriters for all the paperwork they had to deal with. If you or your business needed a typewriter, you could apply to the ration board and you could rent a typewriter from the government. Now, that doesn't mean typewriters that you already owned. These are typewriters that never made it out of the factory. Orders for typewriters with various businesses and whatnot. They didn't have an Office Depot, but if they did, I'm sure Office Depot was very disappointed by not getting their shipment of typewriters in 1942. You had to rent one from the government. The OPA also froze bicycle production on April 3rd, 1942 to prevent hoarding, ultimately placing bicycles, on the ration list in July of 1942. Continued production of a special style of bicycle called the Victory Bike, and this is an example here. It was 1/3 the weight of pre-war bicycles. It used no copper, chrome, or nickel. There were no chain guards, no bells, no fenders. The tires were limited to a width of 1 3/8 inches. 150,000 bicycles were produced. 90,000 pre-war bicycles were still available. So since automobiles were no longer being built, many people in cities relied on bicycles. If you're working in Charlottesville, I guarantee that you don't want a bicycle at this point in time. They were limited in August of 1942 to healthcare workers, teachers, firefighters, and other crucial professions in the United States at the time. Additionally, used bicycles were in demand since used bicycles weren't rationed. But new bicycle sales dropped 35%. Even so, rationing never met the demand for the bicycles that people continued asking for until September of 1945. Come on, there we go. Okay, to pretty much no one's surprise, rubber footwear such as galoshes, overshoes, and other styles, sorry about that, other styles of rubber boots were rationed, but not until October of 1942. Stoves were also rationed in October. Not so much cooking stoves, although there was a demand for that, but stoves and furnaces for heating. Also, the solid fuels were rationed for this very reason as well. December of 1942 saw a number of items added to the OPA ration list. Silk and nylon were especially missed as ladies surrendered their stockings for parachutes for airmen. Lard was rationed as rumors of food rationing abounded. Packaged dried fruit was rationed, primarily because of the lengthy processing process. And jams and jellies slowly worked their way onto the OPA's list of rationed items because of the amount of sugar they needed in order for production. February of 1943 saw the introduction of rationing for shoes, not only because of rubber soles, which were rationed, but also demands on leather by the military. Leather went into an awful lot of gear that was produced for the U.S. military. The OPA limited colors to black, white, town brown, and army russet were the 4 approved colors for shoes. Ladies' heeled shoes were limited to 2 5/8 inches in height. Two-tone shoes were prohibited entirely as they were considered non-essential, such as men's sandals, house slippers, athletic shoes, golf shoes, things like that. Americans were allotted 3 pairs of shoes per year, but were reduced to 2 pairs of shoes in March of 1944. If you spent your workday on your feet, like a postal carrier or a nurse, you were allowed that 3rd pair. That's what they was reserved for. Quality improved when cobblers were finally permitted to purchase new old stock so that they could repair shoes. The government had not put 2 and 2 together right away, thinking that shoemakers, cobblers, were making shoes. No, they're repairing them. So once cobblers were allowed to purchase new old stock, then they could repair shoes, thus reducing the demand even further. This is a chart of the rationed items announced by the OPA to the end of 1943. But if you look underneath shoes, there's something missing there. Usually people think of rationing, they think of food. Food rationing was very important here in the United States during World War II. Everyone still have their war ration books there? Okay, good. Now give it a look and think to yourself, how would we expand this to ration all of the different kinds of food that we produce in the United States? Well, you can't expand this. If you did, you'd have a ration book with 1 million stamps in it. So they had to think of a different way to do this. The reason they did is because of all of the different demands on U.S. food. At the beginning, farmers were farming 364 million acres in 1943 and growing corn on more acreage than the entire Japanese islands acreage. But we were supplying every man, woman, and child in the United States, in addition to supplying all of our troops who are posted overseas. In 1944, it got worse. After D-Day, and we liberated France, Belgium, the Luxembourg, the liberation going on in Italy, lo and behold, we have all sorts of starving allies now that we have to get food overseas to all of our friends over there. In January of 1942, they released War Ration Book number 2. I'm going to pass this around so everybody can get a good idea of what it looks like. This is a reproduction. I made it for a movie and they didn't end up needing it. But inside were coupons listing both an alphabetic, letter of the alphabet and a number. The letter of the alphabet defined the restriction periods for when the stamps were valid. The numbers represent the points, and each one, as you can see, was worth either 1, 3, 5, or 8 points each. Now this is the way it worked. The two colors of stamps represented the two primary categories of food produced in the United States. The first was meat. Those were the red stamps, used for beef, used for pork, used for veal, used for lamb, and even canned fish. The reason fish was included as a rationed item here is because it was canned. It had to be processed. If you go out and caught fish, hey, you win. You get fish without having to spend money or points on your ration card. It also included fats like cooking oil, cheese, and butter. The other category was processed foods. This consisted of canned or bottled vegetables, fruits, soups, juices, and frozen foods, as well as dried fruits, as we've seen already once before. So this system allowed for individual cultural and regional differences across the country because the food was categorized. It wasn't, you can only get beef, or you can only get pork, or you could only get chicken. You could only get chicken if you wanted because chicken was not rationed. All the other meats were. And this allowed people to plan their meals and plan what they were going to eat, all based on their regional preferences. But you still had to pay for it. Let's say, for example, you had a can of peaches and it was 19 cents for the can of peaches, but you also had to turn in the number of points that a can of peaches required. Let's say it was 7 points. So you would take your ration book to the grocery store, get your can of peaches, pay the 19 cents, and the grocer, the cashier, would then remove the 7 points necessary from your ration book. Now, the reason they had to do it that way, as I mentioned, counterfeit gasoline stamps, they were doing counterfeit food ration stamps as well. The black market was huge in the United States, and everybody did their patriotic duty, but a lot of people had some difficulty sacrificing on some of the things that they really enjoyed having. I shudder to think what coffee ration or chocolate rationing would look like in this country today. The OPA, unfortunately, didn't make it easy. Yes, sir?
You haven't mentioned anything about beer, wine, or alcohol.
Those were state regulated. They were not, they were not rationed. They were not rationed, but the state still regulated it. As far as making your own whiskey, the Treasury Department would have quite a bit different feeling about you doing that. In some places, you could grow your own food. You try to make your own whiskey, we're going to have issues. So the OPA didn't make it easy because they changed the value of the items for sale in the store very frequently, sometimes multiple times a year. And it wasn't unusual for somebody to go to the grocery store with their points all budgeted out and their money all budgeted out just to find out they didn't have enough points to get everything. So Americans did what Americans did best, and that was substitute, which you can do with food. It's a little more challenging to do with gasoline. Okay, moreover, here's the bigger problem with the ration book number 2, is that if you purchased an item that was worth 7 points, but you had an 8-point stamp, you got no change. So you've lost 1 point to whatever is the unused points go to, like Island of Misfit Toys or something. But it's gone. So the OPA hadn't quite figured everything out, but they did release Ration Book number 3 on May 20th, 1943. Pass those around so that everybody can get a chance to see those. There were only red point stamps in there. They were designed differently so that grocers could easily distinguish the stamps from the stamps from Ration Book number 2. There we go. That's what that looks like. It's very different from the first design. But there were also these little stamps here, and they weren't designated for something specific, but they had these different designs on them. One was a tank, one was an artillery piece, one was an aircraft carrier, another was an airplane. And these were all patriotic themed stamps, to kind of get everybody feeling good about things. This came out halfway through 1943. We had not experienced a lot of success on the battlefield by 1943. We hadn't even invaded Italy at this point. Now we're making some headway in North Africa, but we've still got quite a row to hoe. The United States didn't land there until a month after Ration Book 3 was issued. But so that each of these little stamps would have a designated valid time period and a designated item that you could get. In the case of the number 4 airplane ration stamp was good for a pair of shoes. It still didn't accommodate for change if you had too many stamps of one thing or another. So in November 1st of 1944, the OPA finally gave us Ration Book 4. Ration Book 4 was the one that if we had rationing today, they would probably still be issuing this one. It was very successful. It came with these little stamps here, and you can see they look very different, again, so that they're not confused with stamps from previous cycles. They came in blue, red, and green. Blue and green were for processed foods. The red stamps were for meats, again. And because they already knew, these books, these ration books, were actually delivered by firefighters. Yes, I'm sorry.
When a new book was issued, if you
Yes.
still had stamps in your old book, were you allowed to use those up?
If they were still valid. Now, intentionally, the OPA issued these ration books so they had a bit of overlap, so that if you've got the last ration period in your ration book and you have a new period for your new ration book, you could double up the stamps if you wanted to. So you could still use all those stamps up. Thank you for asking. At any rate, the Ration Book 4 was delivered by firefighters in the town because they knew where all the houses were. They knew which ones were occupied. And so they were the ones who were tapped. The OPA talked to all the firefighters and got them to actually deliver all of the ration books. Now they also had these 3 little stamps, one for spare, coffee, and sugar. So you could probably imagine what the coffee and the sugar stamps were valid for. Spare was for anything they needed to ration, but they didn't know what that ration was. So they would reserve that spare stamp, so they would let everybody know, hey, on the months of June, July, and August, we have to ration, we have to ration that second pair of shoes. So use the spare stamp number 50 in order to purchase your shoes. It wasn't that they were sitting in a corner dreaming up things that they could ration. They were taking very serious look at supply and demand, but they're administering it across the entire United States with the knowledge of what they would need for the military and what they would need to supply all of our allies and the newly liberated countries. What made Book 4 so revolutionary is that they included these little pressed cardboard OPA tokens that you could use as change. Most of these tokens went to the grocers, to the grocery store. So if you go back to that can of peaches, which you're losing 1 point on because you only have an 8-point stamp, you could get one of these tokens back. Blue tokens were for processed foods, red tokens was for meat. Here's the beauty of it, and I don't know if the OPA planned this or they got caught blindsided. These tokens did not expire. So when you get to the tail end of one valid ration, you go out and you buy the cheapest things you can find that are rationed, and you turn in the biggest number point stamps that you can use, and you start collecting OPA tokens. It worked really, really well because, like I said, the tokens did not expire. I don't have to tell you at this point that the system was complicated. So the government suggested and highly recommended go ahead and plant your own gardens to grow your own food. Fresh fruit, fresh vegetables were not rationed. So if you could grow your own, not only do you not have to pay for it, but you get to have all the food that you grow without having to put in anything other than time and sweat. Half of all U.S. households had a victory garden. They planted them in yards, along sidewalks, in cities, at their jobs, at schools, all over the place. By 1943, 20 million acres of victory gardens had been planted. The government had requested 18 million, but because of the darn do-it of the American public, they planted 20. In 1944, the government asked for 20 million more victory gardens. Americans planted 22. Not going to tell us what to do. By the end of the war, victory gardens were providing 8 million tons of food. Well, growing all that food is great, but if you don't find a way to preserve it in some fashion, it's all going for nothing. So the government put out a very big marketing campaign for teaching people how to do their own canning. And it was, again, wildly successful. They had government publications were available. I've got a few of them up here. There were magazine articles and ads. Newspapers ran articles. There were a number of articles on canning in the Culpeper Exponent. There were radio spots that everybody saw. But the big question now is what was not rationed? It sounds like just about everything on the planet was rationed during World War II. Well, there were quite a few things that you could purchase that were not rationed. Bread was not rationed. Potatoes were not rationed. Honey was not rationed, although I'm sure that came with a good share of bee stings. Syrup was not rationed. Gelatin, like Jell-O, was not rationed. Peanut butter was not rationed. Fish was not rationed. And a whole bunch of other things were not rationed. To give you an idea, Kraft macaroni and cheese in 1943 alone sold 80 million boxes of Kraft macaroni and cheese. It has not died in popularity since. It's dropped now and then, but it has not gone away. And in 1944, they sold 500 million. So it's an amazing, just boxes of Kraft mac and cheese. Well, all good things have to come to an end, but the lousy things have to come to an end too. I don't mean this talk. I hope that anybody didn't get the wrong idea there. On VE Day, most all rationed items were on the OPA's list of controlled items. That was May 8th, 1945. And when VJ Day came on August 15th of 1945, we still had an awful lot that was still being rationed, clean up to 80 years ago today when Japan signed the surrender in Tokyo Bay in 1945. They were well on their way to being removed from rationing. I mean, everybody kind of knew how this war was going to turn out by 1945. So what has been rationed so far, and what's come off of rationing? Like I said earlier, coffee was removed in July of 1943, typewriters in August of 1944. Meats were removed from rationing briefly in May of 1944, But by December, it was reinstated, and it lasted until November of 1945. In August of 1945, the OPA removed gasoline, fuel oil, stoves, processed food, solid fuels, and in September, removed bicycles and rubber footwear as well. In October of 1945, automobiles were back on the market. And everyone could walk a mile for a camel because now they didn't have to walk a mile for a camel because now they could drive there. November saw cheese and fats join the meats category, and the end of December, all other items were removed from rationing with one exception. And I mentioned it at the beginning of the talk, sugar. Sugar came off of rationing in 1947. Now, that's not that bad when you stop and look at what the rest of the world was going through. Rationing did not end in Germany and France until 1950. Part of the reason that Germany was able to come off of rationing, France, and what little in Italy was still going on was the Marshall Plan. These people have a lot to be thankful for us for the Marshall Plan, bringing them back from the brink of utter disaster. England, which, believe it or not, was not part of the Marshall Plan, rationing in England lasted until 1954. Soviet Union rationing lasted until 1959, and the former East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, 1965. Kind of lets you know where everything stood. Trust in the Office of Price Administration was extremely high. When the OPA came out and said we're having difficulty providing this, we have to ration it, people might have grumbled a little bit, but darned if they didn't go ahead and ration it anyway. By the end of the war,